Today we're going to be comparing two of the finest FPS roguelite games the genre has to offer. Gunfire Reborn and Roboquest. We're going to be looking at the games from a more in-depth level such as the gameplay loop, the progression system, build diversity and such, as well as looking at it from a more surface level such as graphics, movement, and how outright fun a game is. But we've got a lot to cover here, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. Graphics is not necessarily something we really care about when we're looking at roguelite games, as some of the best roguelite games out there have nothing but some simple graphics, like Vampire Survivors for example. However, let's check out the graphics we're working with here. For both of these games we have somewhat similar graphic styles, even though both of them are built on two completely different engines. Gunfire Reborn however does incline a little bit more towards less details, and the level designs are much simpler when comparing with Roboquest, where Roboquest actually takes a little bit more of a careful approach to smaller details and actually invests a little bit more effort in the background graphics, whereas Gunfire Reborn just kind of blocks out the background graphics with either fog or sand or something of the sort. I personally prefer Roboquest's art style a little bit more, as it is very reminiscent of Borderlands, which is very easy to look at, clear, bright, colorful, yet far more detailed, which brings more life into the world. One very minor point I want to quickly talk about before we get to the meat and bones of this comparison is the plot of each one of these games. I really won't be spending much time on this, as plot in roguelite games are as important as plot is important in a porn video. We generally just skip it and go straight to the good part, with a few exceptions of course, like Hades. That game was amazing. But anyways, in regards to these two games, Gunfire Reborn doesn't even make an attempt at a plot, which again I think is perfectly fine, but Roboquest does, a very small attempt which actually comes across as quite entertaining, as they don't really try very hard at making some sort of edgy storyline, and instead is just a very simplistic yet kinda cute story that really isn't thrown at your face, and you can skip anytime you don't feel like paying attention to it. Oftentimes you won't even notice it's there, except for when the cinematics appear, which are all very neatly made. But now let's start getting to the good part. First up, the level designs. The level designs in Gunfire Reborn are very much so built kind of like arenas, where you enter a room, you fight about 24 enemies, and then proceed into the next arena-like room and go on to do the same thing. All have very basic designs with not much to it. It's generally just very flat built rooms with a few objects that can be utilized as cover, but that's about as far as it goes. Whereas when we move over to Roboquest, we've got larger rooms. Instead of having the maps being split in several different arenas where you clear one by one, you're actually given a fairly large amount of space to move around, almost as if you've got several different arenas in one big space. You're also not forced to clear out the room before proceeding on to the next one, whereas in Gunfire Reborn you are. Where Roboquest really takes the cake in level design, in my opinion, is that Roboquest also works with a lot of verticality. You're able to reach high places and take the fights from high grounds, and the arenas just have a lot of these high places, low places, a lot of cover, and space to move around, and the map levels are not as dull as they can often be in Gunfire Reborn. Now in both of these games, the level design does also expand beyond just the regular arenas. In Gunfire Reborn, these comes in the shape of secret vaults, which are usually side objectives which can involve some parkour or even a mini boss fight inside of these vaults, and they always reward you with some goodies. In Roboquest, once again, they've seemingly taken what Gunfire Reborn does and added a little bit on top of it. In Roboquest, we also have these side rooms which once again can involve some parkour and in some cases take you to a different level altogether. But what I can't forget to mention that Roboquest does in their level design far better than Gunfire Reborn is the secrets that these levels are equipped with. Exploring these levels thoroughly is not only fun but also very rewarding, as you often come across these collectibles which reward you with a very important currency we'll talk about later on in this video. So the level designs expand beyond just an arena for gunfights and rather actually become more alive as they fill up with fun things to discover. For level design, I undoubtedly have to give the upper hand here for Roboquest. It simply does everything Gunfire Reborn does, Roboquest, but a little bit better. But now, spoiler alert, let's move on to something Gunfire Reborn does better than Roboquest: build diversity. In both of these games, as you're out there making your ways through the level, you pick up several different upgrades that make you stronger, and you ideally want to make sure you try to synergize these upgrades in an attempt to create as powerful of a build as you can. In both games, these upgrades are extremely powerful, and they can entirely change the course of how the rest of your run will look like. However, in Gunfire Reborn, this seems far more impactful. For better or for worse, in Gunfire Reborn, your runs often will depend entirely on the build you were able to create along your way, whereas for Roboquest, even if you properly can't make a build that synergizes effectively, you can still try to make up the dead weight by playing skillfully. Whereas in Gunfire Reborn, if your build is going sideways, you're oftentimes better off just restarting the run, as you'll be doing no damage to elites and bosses later on in the run if things don't start going your way. Now, as far as the characters go, in both games they all play very differently from one another. But once again, in Gunfire Reborn, I feel they're even more so dramatically different from one another, as the upgrades you gain for each character will cater exactly to that character in itself. For example, if you want to build a sniper in Gunfire Reborn, there's a character that's built specifically for that, and you're much better off using a sniper on that character. Whereas the other characters, you can still try to make Sniper somewhat useful, but never come close to that ideal character. In Roboquest, you have something similar, but you can make any character work with any weapon without feeling too much at a disadvantage. In regards of builds though, I do feel like Gunfire Reborn does do one thing wrong. I've played hundreds of hours of Gunfire Reborn way before all the new updates started coming in, and personally, I'm not a huge fan of the direction the game is going. Nowadays in Gunfire Reborn, builds are getting a little bit too out of hand. You're handed up dozens of different upgrades, which are called scrolls in this game, and these start stacking on top of each other the further you go onto the game, and eventually it kind of creates this sort of overly stacked, confusing build that kind of has no direction. It's just one big mess of stacks that make your character so overpowered that you're kind of just breezing through the map, just shooting enemies randomly, seeing hundreds of numbers going up in your screen, and you're not even sure what's doing what, because of how many scrolls you've gathered by this point. Back when I played Gunfire Reborn about a year ago, it used to be a little bit more like how Roboquest is right now. You do gain a decent amount of upgrades, but you have to be very careful about which ones you select, as you'll have a very limited amount of upgrades to work with even way later on in the game. So each upgrade feels far more relevant later on in the runs, and don't just kind of get mixed in a huge mountain of scrolls, leaving you unsure of what's doing what. Regardless, for build diversity, Gunfire Reborn does do a better job. Builds feel far more impactful, to a point that I personally consider it a little bit too impactful, and the game starts to become less about being a skilled player and more about just having a good build. Either way, I'll give the build diversity upper hand here to Gunfire Reborn. Now that's a good segue to talk about the actual fights themselves. Which game has the best movement? In Gunfire Reborn, you're given a dash ability, which can be enhanced to do multiple dashes in a row, but generally this dash is restricted under a cooldown. In this game, you also cannot crouch or slide. Roboquest, on the other hand, has got a lot of movement tools to work with. We don't have dash, but we've got crouching, sliding, rocket jumping, grappling hooks, jetpacking, double jumping, just to name a few. Not only are there more movement techniques, but the movement in Roboquest is also far more smooth than that of Gunfire Reborn. For me, it's not even a competition. Roboquest simply does movement better. Now what about the combat in itself? If I were watching this video, this is the part I would personally have the most interest in, so let me be very thorough here. First off, the general combat. The combat in both games feel great. However, one complaint I have about Roboquest is that it does have some sort of mouse smoothing that I can't quite seem to put my finger on. That was a little bit annoying at first, but by the time I finished my first or second run, I couldn't even feel it anymore. This does seem to be somewhat a common issue across a few different Unreal Engine 4 titles though. Now, if I had to put it as simply as I could when comparing the combat of both of these games, what I would say is that Gunfire Reborn is more focused on builds, and Roboquest is more focused on mechanical skill. In Gunfire Reborn, headshots are very easy to hit and shouldn't be an issue for most players. Combine it with a very simplistic movement, and as far as mechanical skills really go, it is fairly simple. You take cover when you can, dash out of trouble, use your 2 abilities, and try to hit as many headshots as you can. In Roboquest, on the other hand, you've got a bit more of a complex fight. First of all the headshots / weak spots are far harder to hit. They'll often glow red, so it's easier for you to know where the weak spots are, but these are far smaller than in Gunfire. Combine that with sliding, rails, double jumping, jetpacking, rocket jumping, head bonking, the 2 abilities, a more punishing health system, and the general combat is far more complex. And by the way, that's one big gameplay difference between the 2 games. The health system in Roboquest is far more punishing. Your health doesn't regenerate very easily, and your health bar is split in lost health, scratch damage, and current health. Don't worry, we won't go in details about this, but generally it's not really something you have to worry about when you're playing Roboquest. Now, you're also almost never able to regenerate your health back to full if you're really low on health, as the health bots only regenerate a portion of your health, so you definitely don't want to go around taking too much damage from regular units, as that will make your life harder and harder the further you go into the game. In Gunfire Reborn, on the other hand, you have a health and a shield. The shield regenerates back to full whenever you stop taking damage, but the health doesn't. There are, however, various ways to regenerate your health back to full, and thanks to the shield, the health system in Gunfire Reborn is far less punishing. So take this as you wish. Some people will like the more difficult approach, and some will prefer it a little bit easier. Now, as far as boss fight goes, both games have a very similar system. The boss fights work just like a Souls-like boss fight would. The bosses generally attack fairly slow, have a lot of health, and do a lot of damage. And all of their attacks have correct ways for you to properly avoid all damage by utilizing dodging mechanics, so in this regard, both games are extremely similar. So overall, Roboquest in combat requires more of a mechanical skill, utilizing movement to your advantage as well as proper aim. And of course, build will play its own role in your gameplay, whereas in Gunfire Reborn, you're looking at a more of a build crafting point of view. The combats require less mechanical skill and depend more on you synergizing a proper and effective build that will generally carry the fights for you. And as far as the weapons go, I'm not even gonna go in detail here because both games have an incredibly large arsenal of weapons. Both have weapons in common, both have a lot of niche weapons, both do an absolutely fantastic job on that end. Now, we've talked about movement, level designs, graphics, combat, but now let's talk about what makes both of these games roguelite. Let's talk about the gameplay loop and the progression system. As with any great roguelite game, we need a good and rewarding system in between runs that makes us feel a little bit more powerful every time we get back out there. And both of these games have 2 different currencies that work the same way. One currency, which is used strictly inside a run, and another currency which is used outside of the runs to upgrade your character in between each gameplay to make your character a little bit stronger. In Gunfire Reborn, these come in the form of essences, which are utilized to upgrade your overall character, as well as being able to upgrade each of the characters individually. As well as you can utilize essences in other ways, such as purchasing in-run items from Phantom Peddler and other ways. In Roboquest, these come in the form of wrenches, which are utilized to upgrade your runs rather than your characters, such as dropping higher rarity weapons and more. You can also utilize wrenches in runs, but it's not as nearly as impactful as it is in Gunfire Reborn. I'll say Gunfire Reborn does have way more uses with its essences, but both games have similar uses with these, so I will definitely give the edge here for Gunfire Reborn. One interesting way Roboquest does do progression though is in the form of locked rooms. These rooms usually require you to do a few secret tasks, or in some examples unlock them by paying a large amount of power cells, which are in-game currencies. And after you do unlock these rooms, most of these rooms will remain unlocked for all future runs, meaning you can access them and reap their rewards without having to do any extra work, which goes a long way. Now, progression aside, what about gameplay loop? In roguelite games, we restart the game potentially hundreds of times, so the gameplay loop has to remain as interesting as humanly possible. The king of gameplay loop for the roguelite genre, in my opinion, has to be Hades. But what about these 2 games? Starting out with Gunfire Reborn, the gameplay loop can get fairly old after a while, as the lack of changes in biome and the maps being linear makes it so that every run looks visually the same. Whereas in Roboquest, you're actually provided with multiple ways to go on about your runs and take different routes and maps and visit different places and biomes, which makes your run feel far more refreshing visually. What Gunfire Reborn does do, however, is provide players with various different game modes to play, such as challenge runs, for example, and various different modifiers for us to play around with, on top of already having various different difficulties for us to play around with. 11 different difficulties to be exact, whereas Roboquest doesn't offer as nearly as many difficulties and way less modifiers. So what Gunfire Reborn lacks in level designs variations, it does make up for it in this area. I won't comment in which game has a longer lasting gameplay, as I've personally played Gunfire Reborn for over 100 hours, whereas for Roboquest, I've only recently picked it up and I've only played it for about a dozen hours or so. So it's hard for me to compare the two in that regard. And lastly, to close off this video, we'll talk about the most important aspect any video game in this planet needs to succeed at. How fun is it? Overall, Gunfire Reborn I've spent hundreds of hours on, as I've just said. The game is deep in scrolls, had a multitude of weapons, an insane amount of build diversity, and it will get you hooked on it for a very long time. On the other hand, I have about a dozen hours in Roboquest, and where the game seems to shine for me is the mechanical skill aspect to it. The game has a far higher skill ceiling with all of the awesome movement mechanics and fantastic combat system, which keeps me wanting to get better and better at the game, on top of already having all of the things that can be different from run to run. The game is nowhere near getting boring for me, and I definitely look forward to spend about 100 hours on this game at least. If I had to summarize everything we've talked about in this video overall, I'd say Gunfire Reborn is a better game for players looking for a more RPG approach, with theory crafting and creating insane build. And Roboquest is a better game for players looking for a more polished combat system with a high skill ceiling that will have you spending dozens and dozens of hours honing in your skills. Both games are fantastic, and where I stand right now, personally I think the Roboquest is the superior game, as I personally enjoy a very mechanically deep game with a high skill ceiling, which Roboquest 100% scratches that itch for me. What do you guys think? If you've played both, let me know in the comment section below which one you think is the best. And if you've played only one of these, definitely try the other. And if you haven't played either one of these, then what are you waiting for? Both of these games are amazing and they're really cheap. Thank you guys for watching this video. I'll catch you guys in the next one.